Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my buy low trade targets for week 3 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions, players who throughout weeks 1 through 2 just haven't played well for fantasy purposes. And despite this overall lack of production, we still want to target them because we know that they have a potential for upside for the remainder of the season. Therefore, let's go ahead and begin by talking about the thumbnail of today's episode, Ja'Marr Chase, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. And even though Ja'Marr Chase, over the course of the first 2 weeks of the season, has ranked as wide receiver number 39 overall in a half PPR scoring format, and has only accumulated 11 targets, 10 receptions, 97 receiving yards, and 14.7 fantasy points, understand that after week 3, there will be no ability to trade for Ja'Marr Chase based on his overall productivity against the Washington Commanders. That is correct. This upcoming week, he takes on the Washington Commanders, who in 2023 allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers on a per game average, and thus far in 2024 are once again at the top of that conversation. So with the best matchup at the wide receiver position going into this week, a matchup in which the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver scored 4 touchdowns in week 1, of course, Mike Evans 2, Chris Godwin 1, and of course, the rookie McMillan also scored a touchdown. This last week, Wanda Robinson found the end zone, and so did Malik Neighbors with his breakout performance of the season with 10 receptions and over 100 receiving yards. So imagine what, capabilities Ja'Marr Chase has going into this upcoming week. Therefore, we're trading for him. If in fact you have a disgruntled fantasy manager within your league who is either dealing with the fact that Ja'Marr Chase is not playing well and used first round draft capital, and you can go ahead and get yourself into the conversation of trading for him, do so. Perhaps this fantasy manager in your league that has Ja'Marr Chase is dealing with a plethora of injuries. Again, the volume of injuries that have taken place throughout weeks 1 through 2 are ridiculous. So if in fact they're in a situation where they want to get rid of Ja'Marr Chase in order to recoup value at running back and wide receiver, or potentially bring in a valuable tight end, oblige them. Try to get Ja'Marr Chase onto your roster going forward, because we know what he's capable of. If we go back to 2022, healthy Ja'Marr Chase, 11 targets per game, 7 receptions, 87 receiving yards, 0.75 receiving touchdowns per game, 16.58 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Then you go to 2023, Ja'Marr Chase from weeks 3 to 10 was dominating with a healthy Joe Burrow. 11.7 targets, 8.4 receptions, 107 receiving yards per game, 0.71 receiving touchdowns, and 19.11 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. I understand that he did not participate in training camp, and that really is what is slowing him down thus far this season. He still needs to get into the groove of the season, but in the absence of T. Higgins, there's going to be more opportunities going in the direction of Ja'Marr Chase once he finds that overall groove. Honestly, this is the final time to go ahead and trade for Ja'Marr Chase prior to the matchup against the Washington Commanders. Now let's move on to another player who I believe that you should be trading for immediately. That is Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. Thus far this season, throughout the first 2 weeks, is wide receiver 47 overall in a half PPR scoring format, having only accumulated 8 targets, 6 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and 12.9 fantasy points in just the first 2 weeks of the season total. But just putting this into perspective, last season as a member of the New Orleans Saints was averaging these kind of numbers in singular games. Last season averaging 8.6 targets, 5.4 receptions, 70 receiving yards, 0.3 receiving touchdowns, and 11.74 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. So to say the very least, he has underperformed over the course of the first 2 weeks, in which the New Orleans Saints have had record-breaking numbers in terms of the New Orleans Saints are the 3rd team in NFL history to score 30 points in the first half of 2 consecutive games to begin a season. So obviously their level of success is up there, and what Clinton Kubiak has been able to do in terms of evolving this offense to that next level is certainly going to eventually bleed in the direction of Chris Olave, who in time will find himself being an extremely valuable fantasy wide receiver. But one of the primary reasons we want to trade for him isn't just because of his overall potential, but what we have seen just this last Sunday against the Dallas Cowboys has 2 opportunities of scoring a touchdown, a 39-yard reception and a 19-yard reception. Both of those plays, the play after Alvin Kamara rushing touchdown, and then the play after a Derek Carr 1-yard rushing touchdown, very easily could have been a Chris Olave touchdown prior to that, if in fact the ball was in the correct positioning. But either way, there is so much value to be had with Chris Olave, a part of an offense and a team that is just blowing teams out. In time, he is going to be able to find himself a lot of fantasy value, and we want to go ahead and do that before the week 3 matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, their secondary has not played well over the course of the 2023 and thus far the 2024 season. And yes, this video is being recorded prior to the Monday Night Football game in which they take on the Atlanta Falcons, but the expectation is that, of course, that secondary is still going to struggle, as that is their weakest part of their defense and often picked on. The expectation going forward is a lot of success for Chris Olave. So if in fact the opportunity is there, try to go ahead and trade for him. Now, speaking of the Philadelphia Eagles, for those of you who are trying to take advantage of the free pick for new customers going into tonight's game against the Atlanta Falcons, be sure to do so today. Travel down to the description of the video, head on over to Underdog Fantasy, and sign up using code Andrew, because not only will you be able to take advantage of a free pick going into tonight's game, but you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex. All encompassing rankings. All you got to do is use code Andrew today via Underdog Fantasy, and of course make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, and of course be eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen. If you're interested in taking advantage of this opportunity, be sure to do so. If you guys want my rankings and potentially aren't available based on your location, or you've used the code in the past, you can also check out Patreon, link down in the description, where you can find all this content and much more. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's continue on with the wide receiver conversation with Brandon Aiyuk, another player that after this week I think is going to be very difficult to trade for him. Now, very similar to Jamar Chase, obviously didn't find himself participating in training camp as he was trying to get a contract, and he has found himself a massive contract where he eventually is going to show everyone that he earned it, because he truly is a top tier wide receiver in the National Football League. And despite his overall lack of production, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 71 receiving yards, and 10.1 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks, ranking as wide receiver 57 overall in a half PPR scoring format. Don't forget the last season, even with a lack of opportunity of 6.73 targets per game, Brandon Aiyuk was averaging 13.85 fantasy points per game on average. And in the absence of Christian McCaffrey, once Brandon Aiyuk finds his footing and his groove within this season, I mean, the lack of Christian McCaffrey really has shown that this offense, without the ability to throw the ball to their running back out of the backfield, I mean, really, there is a lot of yardage up for grabs, and Brandon Aiyuk could absolutely come in and find himself basking in all of that opportunity going forward in a 100% healthy and ready to go status. Now, as we progress, he's going to get himself into the position, and I think going into this week against the Los Angeles Rams, this is a perfect opportunity for him to have a breakout performance, because the Rams look like they're in absolute shambles with all the injuries that they have accrued over the course of the last 2 weeks, and the fact that their secondary, specifically their number one cornerback, has been destroyed by Jamison Williams in week 1, and most recently Marvin Harrison Jr. in week 2. Why not another wide receiver on the outside like Brandon Aiyuk to take advantage of this? Brandon Aiyuk in the first 2 weeks of the season, with no training camp, has had to take on cornerbacks of the level of Sauce Gardner and Stephon Gilmore. Now has a break going up against Tre'Davious White, in which he should be able to find himself a lot of potential for success in an advantageous matchup. This is an opportunity to trade for Brandon Aiyuk before he breaks out, and then is at that point a very difficult potential option to trade for. All right, let's move on out of the wide receiver position. Let's talk about some running backs, specifically Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs, throughout the first 2 weeks of the season, holds the most rushing attempts amongst all running backs, is tied with Jordan Mason in that category with 48 rushing attempts. Josh Jacobs currently sitting at RB21 overall, despite the fact that he has played extremely well, hasn't scored a touchdown. And for the fantasy managers in your league who had the opportunity of drafting Josh Jacobs and have him on roster, they may be a little bit flustered based on his overall contributions. So if in fact you have an opportunity to trade for him, maybe send a player like Brian Robinson Jr. away, James Conner away, and still get a player of the caliber of Josh Jacobs back, you should do so. Mainly because thus far this season, despite the fact that he is leading the league in rushing attempts, a 4.9 yard per carry average, 3.77 yards after contact per attempt. To put into perspective just how valuable that is, I mean, again, 4.9 yards per carry, that's one of the best numbers that Josh Jacobs has ever presented in his career. Additionally, 3.77 yards after contact per attempt. Thus far this season, Najee Harris is just averaging 3.7 yards per attempt, much less after contact, where Josh Jacobs is dominating. The expectation going forward with a running back that is currently playing 70% of the offensive snaps and handling 76% of the running back rushing attempts, still getting himself utilization within the receiving game, is that once in fact Jordan Love returns from his injury, again, the fact that they didn't put him on the injured reserve is very promising, and that the hope is he will return sooner rather than later. I mean, even this last week, even though he didn't play, was questionable. That means that he is relatively close to potentially returning. And you want to go ahead and trade for a player of this caliber, because once in fact Jordan Love returns and this offense elevates, there's going to be far more opportunity for touchdowns. If it wasn't for the fact that Josh Jacobs just recently, yesterday, against the Indianapolis Colts, fumbled out of the end zone and lost the opportunity of scoring a touchdown, if he had scored that touchdown, I wouldn't be suggesting him today, because it probably would be impossible to trade for him. What you want to do is trade for him. I mean, prior to the season beginning, we had him as a top 10 running back. We're going to continue to maintain that. And once, in fact, you do trade for him, please be sure to pick up Marshawn Lloyd just in case, because you always want to have your handcuff to your blue chip running backs. Now let's move on to another running back who, again, is in that top 10 conversation that has not played well in the first 2 weeks of the season. Right next to Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs thus far this season, RB21. Travis Etienne has been RB22 in the first 2 weeks of play. Now, in comparison to a guy like Josh Jacobs, Travis Etienne has not been efficient, but he has found the end zone and quite frankly, could have had himself a third rushing touchdown if it wasn't for the fact that he fumbled into the end zone in week 1. But thus far, 25 rushing attempts in 2 weeks for 96 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, could have been a third, but nonetheless, going forward, considering Tank Bigsby, of course, had himself a shoulder injury in week 1. Now, that shoulder injury that took place to Tank Bigsby yesterday wasn't even in an offensive play. It was during special teams. So going forward, if Tank is going to miss time, and this offense continues to play as badly as they have, it is going to lead to far more negative game scripts. And if, in fact, we are going to be in negative game scripts in the form of Travis Etienne, a player that they have spoken about all offseason in terms of getting him more utilization within the receiving game, the expectation is that that opportunity should continue in his direction. We know he is the clear goal line back. We know that he's going to be given rushing opportunity. But if, in fact, they're able to utilize him far more as a receiving back, of course, the sky's the limit in terms of his overall potential for production because we have seen it last season finishing as RB3 overall, that when you're able to get over 55 receptions in a year, he is certainly going to be of value. Thus far this season, they've only lined him up in the slot or out wide. A total of 13% of his overall routes ran, typically just running routes out of the backfield and or pass blocking in order to help protect Trevor Lawrence as he throws incompletions. But nonetheless, when we talk about Travis Etienne and his potential for success for the remainder of the season, still a top 12 back and someone that if in fact you can go ahead and get on roster within a trade this week, be sure to do so. Now, another and final running back in this top 10 conversation that we drafted, whether it is in the back end of the first round or the beginning of the second round, is Jonathan Taylor. You should probably trade for him now because his upcoming schedule is really, really nice. The Bears, the Steelers, the Jaguars, the Titans, and the Dolphins. All teams whose quarterbacks are heavily struggling. And quite frankly, this should be an opportunity, despite the fact that the Indianapolis Colts themselves look like a mediocre team overall. They're taking on a bunch of mediocre teams as well. The Bears, Steelers, Jaguars, Titans, and Dolphins. All teams who, as of late, really cannot score. So if we're going to have close matchups in which we can allow Jonathan Taylor to run the ball effectively, currently over the course of the last 2 weeks, as ranked as RB19 overall with 28 attempts, 151 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, but 5.4 yards per carry and 3.64 yards after contact per attempt. And once, in fact, you even add a negative game script there, he's also getting himself more upside for receiving utilization. But nonetheless, going forward, considering these matchups are going to be relatively close in terms of scoring, we should see far more potential upside of rushing attempts for Jonathan Taylor and effectively far more production for fantasy purposes. That is why we're continuing to trade for him, because we know he has top 5 upside for fantasy purposes at the running back position. Let's move on and talk about a different position, perhaps the tight end position, in the form of Sam LaPorta, who has gone missing the last couple weeks. Currently, he is ranked as tight end 16 overall. But, obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams have clearly been the target favorites of this offense. But Jared Goff hasn't played well. Jared Goff, over the course of the last 2 games, has 0 red zone passing touchdowns. And that's where Sam LaPorta found a lot of his success. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, tight ends for the Detroit Lions have scored 8 or more receiving touchdowns within those given years. So the expectation going forward is that once, in fact, Jared Goff finds his footing within this red zone, Sam LaPorta is going to be able to find himself an abundance of success and once again be in this top tight end conversation for fantasy purposes. Going into this week against the Arizona Cardinals should be a potential shootout between these 2 great offenses. And quite frankly, both of their secondaries have not played well thus far this season. So Sam LaPorta, if in fact he is available in your league, you have a disgruntled fantasy manager in which they're sick of his lack of production, obviously utilize high draft capital to bring him in. If you have an opportunity of sending away a Brock Bowers, who has played extremely well at the top of this position, and still bring back a player of Sam LaPorta's opportunity, you should go ahead and do so. Now, another player that I absolutely want to still trade for is Travis Kelce. Unfortunately, earlier today, we did get the news that Isaiah Pacheco is going to be missing somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks with the fibula injury. So this offense should continue to pass the ball far more. And I understand that Travis Kelce's performance yesterday was beyond underwhelming, but if you go ahead and look at his overall production against the Cincinnati Bengals in seasons past, in games past, typically he never finds himself a lot of success. Lou Anarumo, the defensive coordinator of the Cincinnati Bengals, typically puts himself in a pretty good position to double team Travis Kelce and force, Patrick Mahomes to look elsewhere. And there's a reason why Patrick Mahomes yesterday had himself only 150 passing yards, is because, again, he couldn't find Kelce because they shut him down. So going forward, the expectation without Isaiah Pacheco is that this offense should turn into a pass funnel. They should be throwing the entire time. And when you only have running backs of the caliber of Samaje Perine and, maybe if in fact Clyde Edwards-Helaire returns after the injured reserve stint in week 4, Carson Steele, I guess, is okay. But ultimately, the running game is going to be a shell of itself in comparison to where it has been in weeks past. Therefore, Travis Kelce should find himself more opportunity. And if, in fact, you can buy him at an all-time low because he has never played this poorly in the beginning of a season. Actually, that's a lie. A couple years ago, he also had a pretty rough start to the beginning of the season and then went ahead and took off. So there's always an opportunity of buying low on Travis Kelce now and finding the dividends of that going into the future. Now, another player that is a veteran that many people think is declining, very similar to Travis Kelce, is Keenan Allen. And Keenan Allen obviously did not play in last night's game against the Houston Texans, but once in fact Keenan Allen returns, please try to trade for him now because of his injury. Keenan Allen is going to be a huge part of this Chicago Bears offense, and it is clearly because Caleb Williams cannot complete passes more than 10 yards down the field. In the first 2 games of Caleb, Williams' overall career, he only has 4 passing completions 10 or more yards down the field. Just to bring it up in terms of overall production, this is the overall passing chart from last night's game against the Houston Texans. Again, not very many passes down the field, that resulted in completions, much less majority of them leading to an interception of sorts. Therefore, if Keenan Allen is going to return healthy and play in that slot position and go ahead and garner the vast majority of these shorter overall passes, because that is exactly what Caleb Williams is comfortable with, then we should find success. Now, when we go ahead and present the week prior against the Tennessee Titans, 4 for 29 passing, but again, all of the overall opportunities very close to the line of scrimmage. There's a reason why Keenan Allen had 11 targets in that first game. So going forward, the expectation is that Keenan Allen should have himself an abundance of opportunity when healthy within this offense, because again, when DeAndre Carter comes in to fill in for Keenan Allen and is finding himself a lot of opportunity, that kind of gives us an indication that going forward, Keenan Allen is going to be a very valuable piece for this offense and really a security blanket for Caleb Williams in the coming weeks. All right, let's move on to another position. Let's talk about Jaylen Warren, a running back that last season finished as RB25 overall. And thus far this season has obviously dealt with himself a hamstring injury in the preseason, and in week 1 didn't get himself much opportunity. But thus far in week 2, his overall contributions elevated to a level into which I believe Jaylen Warren going forward is going to be a top 36 running back, and someone that, if in fact you don't have running back depth, perhaps you've dealt with a lot of injuries. Christian McCaffrey, Isaiah Pacheco, players that are continuing to go down with injury. Kenneth Walker, obviously we're hoping that he could return sooner rather than later. But if in fact you're dealing with injuries at running back, bringing in a player of the caliber of Jaylen Warren isn't going to be difficult because he really hasn't produced much throughout the first 2 weeks, but we know what he's capable of based on his contributions last season. We know that he's the most efficient back on a per carry average in this Pittsburgh Steelers backfield. So going forward, if in fact you can get an opportunity of bringing in Jaylen Warren, maybe he's gone ahead and been dropped in your league. You never know. Pick him up, put him on your roster, maybe trade for him and have him be an extra piece where you can scoop him up and bring him to your roster, because going forward, he could very easily be a solid RB2, if not a flex, especially in a full PPR format once he gets the receiving utilization to grow within the offense. All right, another running back I wanted to mention is Aaron Jones. If in fact you're in a position where, again, you are dealing with running back injuries, again, you've lost Pacheco, bringing in a player of the caliber of Aaron Jones, I think is not going to be that difficult. And based on his most recent productive week against the San Francisco 49ers, which of course is a very difficult matchup, he didn't find himself a lot of opportunity, much less success. But the Minnesota Vikings are far better than we honestly thought they were going to be. And Aaron Jones currently being RB20 is exactly where we thought he would finish by the end of this upcoming season. But based on his overall effectiveness in terms of a per carry average, 23 attempts for 126 yards and a rushing touchdown, 5.48 yards per carry and 4.17 yards after contact per attempt, despite his older age, is top 15 in missed tackles forced, is top 6 in rushes of 10 yards or more, and top 6 in terms of running back targets. Aaron Jones, a running back that I want right now on all of my teams, because if in fact he can stay healthy and I have an opportunity of picking up Ty Chandler, for many of you who play in a 10-team league, Ty Chandler is probably available. And maybe he's going to go ahead and get picked up in this upcoming waiver wire period, because of course he had himself 10 rushing attempts, but it wasn't a matter of neglecting Aaron Jones of opportunity in terms of snaps. Aaron Jones still got himself a lot of opportunity within the receiving game, and going forward is still going to be the clear number 1 running back of this Minnesota Vikings offense that, again, like I mentioned, is a lot better than we initially thought they were going to be. The final player I wanted to mention on today's episode is Drake London. Prior to tonight's game, if you have an opportunity of buying him, I would do so. Legitimately, I think that Drake London is a very talented wide receiver. And once, in fact, Kirk Cousins finds his footing, and it could very easily happen tonight against the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, the Eagles really do struggle against opposing wide receivers. Their secondary has struggled over the course of the last couple of years. Last season, amongst all teams, top 2 in the conversation, only behind the Washington Commanders in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. They've changed a couple of their pieces in terms of personnel, but even, in week 1, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, they all found success within the overall matchup. So the expectation is that Drake London could have himself a big performance here, but if you're able to buy low on him today, great. If in fact he even doesn't have a great performance today, I'd even double down to the idea that I'm going to still try to buy him low going into week 3 and beyond, because again, as the clear number 1 of a Kirk Cousins offense, once Kirk Cousins finds himself his footing within this team and within the Atlanta Falcons organization, we will begin to see the Atlanta Falcons throwing the ball far more than they have over the course of the last 3 seasons here. And a lot of those opportunities going in the direction of Drake London. Okay, that's going to cover it in terms of my buy low targets going into this upcoming week. Again, this could change by the time we get to later on in the week based on injuries, based on different conversations. But overall, these are players that I want prior to week 3, because truly they're going to have, productive weeks to the extent to where it is going to be that much more difficult to trade for them. So go ahead, attack it now. Try to get after these pieces. Try to take the players that have played, incredibly well thus far, like a J.K. Dobbins or a Brian Robinson Jr., and try to get some of these running backs. Again, there are a lot of wide receivers that have had an abundance of success. A Rashid Shaheed, yes, has found himself so much success in the first 2 weeks. Try to flip him. Try to make the most of it. Okay, thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with waiver wire targets for week 3. After, of course, the Monday night game tonight, I will be live streaming here on the channel. So for those of you interested and have waiver wire questions, trade questions, be sure to swing on by. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.